Anthropological theory. Now, there's a whole chapter on this in your textbook. We'll be exploring some variations of what's in the textbook so that hopefully together between the lecture and the textbook, you'll get a pretty good concept of what anthropology is all about. So if we're going to be looking at this topic, quite frankly, what we need to do is break it up into components again, and we're going to look at the 5 goals of anthropological inquiry. Then we're going to look at 6 very specific research questions associated with anthropological inquiry, and then we will look at 6 theoretical approaches to how to engage in anthropological inquiry. And this will bring us from the very early days of the scientific study of cultures right up to the present. We will conclude it all then by saying, okay, how does that impact us as evangelicals? So, what are the goals of anthropological inquiry? What is it that anthropologists are studying? Why are they looking at these phenomenon? And every discipline is going to have a certain kind of research objectives, if you would. So the first question that anthropologists are going to ask is, what do people do? Simply developing the strategies for describing what people do. Now, one of the early experiments that I engaged in when I was on the field was sitting in a men's house with a group of villagers, and a woman came by in the early evening hours, late afternoon hours, and she dropped off a net bag full of sweet potatoes. And the man who was nearest the door, he thanked her profusely, pulled the net bag into the men's house, turned it over, got all the sweet potatoes out, and handed the net bag out to her, because women were not usually allowed into the men's house. And then she went off on home, and we had this, so maybe a 25-pound pile of sweet potatoes. And this was going to be the first course for our evening meal. And so they started to prepare it. And that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to be an observer here. I am going to figure out, what do people do? And in this particular case, how do they prepare their evening meal? And so I watched as they, first thing they did was build up a pretty good sized fire in the central fireplace in the middle of the men's house. And they let it burn there for maybe 45 minutes, and then they pulled all the wood off, and then they dug a little hole down in the ash pit. And that's when they started sticking all the sweet potatoes down in there. And then they covered the sweet potatoes over with ash. Then they put firewood back onto the top of it, and continued to have a fire above the sweet potatoes. And I realized, okay, the first thing they've done here is they've prepared a nice bed of hot ash, charcoal, and when they got that prepared, then they put the sweet potatoes down in, then continued to cook on top of it. And then after a while, a man took a long stick that had been split a little bit, so it kind of made like a pair of tongs, and he dug down in there underneath the fire and pulled one of the sweet potatoes out and quickly tested it to see if it was soft. And yep, it's just about ready. And so sure enough, they pulled all the wood off, dug down in there, pulled all of the sweet potatoes out of the ashes, put the wood back on, and then pass the sweet potato around, or maybe 2 sweet potatoes around to everybody in the room. Then we all peeled the skin off of the sweet potato and we started eating away. And I said, wow. So I wrote that all down. This is the way they cook sweet potatoes. Now that's only one way. I discovered that there are several ways to cook sweet potatoes. And so I repeated this experience several times until I had a whole set of notes simply describing how to cook sweet potatoes Donnie style. Now that's just one activity. Anthropologists do that for everything that people do, depending upon their research interests. A good ethnography will describe everything that a people does. Well, maybe not everything. I mean, who wants to know how many ways there are to pick your nose, you know? We're not going to describe everything. But we will try to describe important behaviors and write it up as an ethnographic study. So what do people do? Developing a science for descriptive behaviors. When people sit down, do they sit there with their legs crossed? If they cross their legs, do they cross them at the knees or at the ankles? Is there a significance to crossing the legs? I came up with an interesting research question. I haven't even got the answer to it. Do all children skip? You know, you've seen kids skipping down the sidewalk. Do children in Africa skip? Now, I've never been to Africa, but I don't know. If I ever get to Africa, one of the things I've got to look for are whether kids skip. Or is this something that only happens on concrete playgrounds or sidewalks or smooth surfaces? I mean, I've seen kids skipping in airports. I've seen kids skipping on playgrounds. I don't believe I ever recall seeing Donnie kids skipping down the trail. But I never really stopped to ask that question. So we learn to ask, what do people do? And we begin to sharpen our senses for observing similarities and differences in human behaviors. Then we have to ask the question, are there patterns to what people do? Are there patterns for what they do? Do certain kinds of behaviors fit together? For instance, Donnie men usually walk behind their wives. Donnie men usually carry a bow and an arrow, or several arrows. And the women coming back from the gardens are coming back with a huge load of sweet potatoes and perhaps even a kid or two on their shoulders. So here they are. These women are all bowed over, carrying a 50-pound sack of sweet potatoes from the garden and another 10-pound kid on their shoulders. And here comes Dad walking along, and he's already got a bow and arrow. And, you know, the first thing you want to say is, hey, come on, you lazy slob, help your wife carry some of these sweet potatoes. But there's a pattern here. See? You have to begin to understand some of the behavior patterns here. Why are the men behind? What is happening here? And you begin to notice that this takes place throughout all of this particular tribal society. Now, in some cultures, men walk ahead of their wives or ahead of women. And in our culture, it used to be typical, I don't know if it's typical anymore, it used to be typical that men would open the door for women to go through first. You begin to look at these patterns and you begin to put them into other patterns. What are the ways in which people in a particular culture express appreciation or relate to one another, particularly when it comes to male behaviors and female behaviors? And you start to put all of these into their groups to look for patterns. If you see A, you will probably see D. But if you have B, you will have F. And if you can start finding patterns, then you come up with some very interesting, fascinating stuff. Now, there was a similarity that we discovered, or pattern, not similarity, pattern. We found that there was a pattern. There is a pattern in cultures that seems to be quite universal. In cultures where women's roles are in transition, or where women's roles are sometimes threatening to men, you have increased incidences of witchcraft accusations. When men feel threatened by women, or by women's position in the society, they have a greater fear of those women, and they will often accuse them of doing bad things with their power. Now, this seems to be a regular pattern. Now, I found it interesting that we lived in a culture where women's black magic was greatly feared, where women were often held for trial for conducting black magic to kill a man. In one instance, I was able to attend and watch the trial of a woman who was being accused of witchcraft. I believe that we were able to give enough testimony to preserve her life. In another instance, we were not able to exert any influence, and the woman was bound up and thrown into the river to drown. And in a third instance, the woman was found guilty, and they ground limestone into her eyes and blinded her. I lived in this kind of a culture. They were afraid of women's black magic. But 50 miles further east of us was another branch of the Dani tribe. And in that branch of the Dani tribe, women were much more subject to the powerful male leaderships of that particular community. And they did not have the great fear of women's black magic. They made fun of the Western Dani, where I was living, and of the Western Dani fear of women's black magic. And at one point, because there's a lot of rivalry between the Balim Dani and the Western Dani, the Western Dani accused the Grand Valley Dani, you guys are a bunch of cannibals, at least we don't eat one another. And that was true. The Western Dani were not cannibals, the Grand Valley Dani were. Then the Grand Valley Dani responded, yeah, well, at least we're bold enough to eat them physically. You guys over there in the Western Dani, you eat them spiritually through black magic. Well, however that may be, there's some patterns here. And as I began to realize those patterns, it began to explain some of the things I was observing. So we look for those patterns. And then we have to ask the question, why do people do what they do? Now, we are not simply a discipline that describes. Sometimes we've been accused by others in other disciplines as being a purely descriptive discipline. Oh, all they do is describe what people do. We don't want to be able to just describe what they do. We want to know why they do it. Well, indeed, that is one of the questions that we ask, but it is a more difficult question to answer. Why do we do what we do? You know what? Most of us don't know why we do what we do. We just do it. Now, in our culture, it is not at all uncommon for a couple of guys to, be limbering up for an athletic event, and one of the guys will say, "Hey, man, you look kind of tense," and we'll kind of knead their back and kind of loosen up their shoulder muscles. And oh man, yeah, I'll give you all day to stop that. You probably said that. So yeah, but that's a Western trait. I was there in West Papua, and we were on a trail, and we were way out there, and we were all uptight and tense. And I thought I'd kind of give a little shoulder massage to one of the Donnies that I was trekking with, and I said, "Hey, come here." I said, "Let me give you a little relief here." And I started to knead his shoulders. Oh man, you'd have thought I had just stuck him with needles. Oh man, that hurts. Oh no, don't do that. Hey man, it feels good. What you have begun to associate as being something good, he associated with, I was hurting him. It's very uncomfortable. He didn't want me to do it. Instead, he said, "You want to help me?" He said, "Here," and he dug into his bag and he pulled out a nettle leaf, a stinging nettle. And he said, "Here, rub that on my back." So I did. I started rubbing this stinging nettle all over his shoulders, and the skin all popped up with a rash, And he said, "Oh," he said, "that feels so good." And I thought, that's smarts, dude. But he liked it. To him, that was how he would get relief in his muscles. Now, why do we do these kinds of things? Well, he had no idea why he would prefer stinging nettle to a shoulder massage. I would have to figure that out. And indeed, that is one of the things that becomes a little bit more problematic, because then we have to assign causation to what people do. And sometimes we get it wrong. Anthropologists have often got it wrong. But at least they're trying, and we are trying. And we will try to understand people's behavior. Why do they do what they do? The fourth question we have to ask ourselves is, what causes the differences in what they do? Now, there are several ways to structure our families. There are several ways to structure our kinship relationships. We're going to be looking at these in a future lecture. The question is, why would we have these differences? One of the things we're going to look at is how various ways of organizing the family, how various ways of addressing human problems have been attempted, experimented with, or practiced as each of us have sought to resolve some of the basic issues of living together. And we're going to look at those differences. We're going to try to come up with some of the causations behind them. And then we have to ask a final question. Why do people change what they do? Sometimes we become unhappy with what we're doing. Sometimes we decide to change our behaviors to find a more satisfying way of life. When the early settlers came from Europe to America, they decided that they were fed up with the European way of life. They'd quite had it with hierarchical forms of society, where you had nobles and peasants, where you had merchants and you had landowners. They were not real super satisfied with this way of life. As a matter of fact, in those days, if a servant girl accidentally kicked over or knocked over a bucket of milk, it was considered theft. And a poor old milkmaid in England enraged her owner for knocking over a bucket of milk. He accused her of stealing. He threw her into jail, and she was carted off to Australia as a convict and had to start life over in Australia as a convict. And what was her crime? Spilling some milk. You know what? A lot of those folk came to America as well as Australia. Some of the old Hayward lads that are my ancestors, they came to America as prisoners. Now they weren't guys that stole stuff. They weren't clumsy and knock over they were actually rebels. Lord Monmouth decided that he was the illegitimate. You probably don't know your English history that well, but Lord Monmouth was the illegitimate son of the king, and he decided that he wanted to be king instead of his brother. So he mounted a rebellion against King James. You know, the same guy that wrote or commissioned the King James Bible. So he, Lord Monmouth, raised up a rebellion. A bunch of the Hayward lads joined in the rebellion, and they attacked King James's troops, and voila, they lost. And so Lord Monmouth, he went to prison and lost his head, and the Hayward lads were given a choice. We'll behead you if you want to stay with Lord Monmouth, or we can send you to the New World, to a penal colony there, and you can work off your rebellion. And the lads were not too awfully dumb. They all said, we'll go to the New World. And a bunch of them were sent to Jamaica, and they became servants, slaves, prisoners in the sugarcane industry, and many of them married slave women who were coming from Africa. So there is a black African American English line of the Hayward family. You go down to Jamaica, there's Haywards all over the place, and they don't look like me. There are a bunch that were sent to Virginia to work in the Virginia colony, and this accounts for the Virginia clan of the Haywards. But while they were here in this country, one of the things they said was, we're not happy with the legal system, with the social system, with the political system, and above all, the taxation system in the old world. We want to form a more perfect union. Have you heard that phrase? You better. In order to form a more perfect union. Cultures do change, sometimes willingly, sometimes by force, sometimes by choice, and sometimes because it is the only way to survive. But people will change. We want to know why they change. What are the conditions that bring about change? What gives direction to change? These are the kinds of questions that anthropologists ask. We think they're fairly important questions, especially if we are in the business of trying to share with people a more perfect way to live in harmony with God and in harmony with one another. If we're going to propose a new way of living, we ought to understand some of these essentials. So these are the 5 goals. Now there's going to be 6 different research questions that are going to consume our attention. The first question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the role of biology and genetics in determining human behavior? Are you nothing more than the product of your inheritance? Do you do what you do because you are biologically determined? Now, this has been a long debate. There are those who say that people cannot transcend their biology. There are those who say we are biologically determined. And if we're not biologically determined 100%, at least 85%, 90%. And there's this ongoing struggle regarding biological determinism. And there is a current set of research that's being done by numerous scholars. Are people who are homosexual born to be homosexual by a certain kind of genetic trait? Are certain people who are criminals because they have a criminal trait? And indeed, biological studies of criminals has indicated that there are certain very distinct characteristics that accompany criminal minds. We have to look at these things. What is the role of biology and genetics in determining human behavior? Now, years and years ago, I read a dissertation. It was a lousy dissertation. I won't tell you the author. I won't tell you the title of it because I do not want to embarrass him. But I read this dissertation, and he said there's 3 sons of Noah, Ham, Sheth, and Japheth. Those 3 create 3 racial types, and each one of them has distinctive biological and emotional traits. And some of them are very, very spiritual, the Shemites. And they have a propensity, a biological propensity for spiritual reflection. And then there are the Hamites, and they are the industrious ones. And then there are the Japhethites, and they are the philosophers. And I said, what a bunch of boulder dash. That's a clean way of saying something else, but anyway. This is a big question that anthropologists are seeking to answer, and we've made a lot of progress. We've still got a long way to go, but it continues to be a major research question. The second question we have to ask is, what is the role of ecology in the development of human behavior? What is the role of ecology in the development of human behavior? Now, one of the early ways that this question was asked and answered was people from the northern hemisphere, where it's colder, where they've got to work real hard during the summer, bring in their harvest in the fall because they've got to prepare for winter, that people from the northern climates have a greater opportunity, greater propensity for long-range planning. They're much more industrious than people who live down in the tropics, where if you want something to eat, all you got to do is go out and climb up a coconut tree, pull a coconut off, come down, crack it open, and maybe go out and swim in the lagoon and do a little fishing, and you don't have to plan. You could be kind of lazy. As a matter of fact, one of the early conclusions of Europeans when they came across the various cultures of the world was, Northerners are industrious and Southerners are lazy. Well, is that really true? Now, I'll tell you this. When I was living in the tropics, I loved an afternoon siesta. There's no question about it. I did not want to work in the heat of the day. So we would get up really early, right at the crack of dawn, and we would work 4 or 5 hours. Bring ourselves right up to the noon hour, have a light lunch, and then lay down and sleep for a couple of hours. Get up, go take a bath in the cold river, and then come back and work several hours in the evening. Now that makes perfect logical sense. See, ecology does impact human behaviors. What are the most productive times? What do we discover about one another? What do we discover about the best ways to maximize our human potential within the ecological constraints? Third, what are the driving forces of human nature that most powerfully determine the patterns of human behavior? What motivates you to behave in the manner that you behave? What is it that drives you to spend 4 years of your life subjecting yourself to the rigors of a college education? Well, if you go to a guidance counselor, one of the things they're going to tell you is you will make more money as a college graduate than you will as a high school graduate. College graduates routinely make $20,000 a year more than a high school graduate. So money is your motivation. Well, is that why you're here? Did you come to Biola to become wealthy? You might as well drop out right now, because it's probably not going to happen. But comfortable, maybe. Maybe that'll work. Are there other things that drive people? Power, prestige, women, all kinds of things will drive us. And one of the things we want to look at is what drives people, what drives entire cultures. And we just had a really interesting incident here a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you read about it in the newspaper. A guy. I'm going to identify him because ethnically, I don't want to make it an ethnic issue, but he is Hispanic, and he has bought into a certain kind of value system that we describe as machismo. And so this Hispanic guy was in a particular setting, and he was beating up on a gal. And he felt that was his right. And another man and his wife came along and interceded and stopped him from beating up this gal. Well, that infuriated the first man, and so he waited until the couple came out of the store, and then he followed them home. And then he came back after he found out where they lived, and he sprayed the house with bullets. Ended up killing the little girl, the little 3-year-old girl, shooting the woman, and injuring her daughter as well. Now, why did he do that? Because he felt that the man who intervened in his right to beat up his girlfriend had stolen some of his manhood. This is a whole part of a machismo culture. And he had to get that back by demonstrating that he was a powerful individual to be feared. So he shot up the home, killed the little girl, and seriously wounded the woman. Well, he's in jail now, and he can prove his machismo in prison for the rest of his life. But these powerful driving forces, we need to understand them, and we need to understand what drives cultures. All right, 4. How can we ascertain the information necessary for answering these questions? And is it possible to get the correct information? How do we find out these answers? What are the research techniques that we're going to develop? Can we even get the correct information? This is going to consume thousands upon thousands of hours of anthropologist inquiry. Every year, thousands of anthropologists gather in the month of November for the American Anthropological Association meetings, and they will have literally hundreds of workshops, and people will attend these workshops, and they will all be focused on various topics having to do with engaging in research, the ways of engaging in research, particular topics. What should we be looking for? How should we be looking for it? What are the strategies that we use? And we will continue to perfect research methods for getting this correct information. What makes human beings social creatures? Social creatures who are open to establishing rules and regulations upon their behavior. Why do we enjoy being with other people? What is it about being a social creature? And now, do you remember seeing that movie by Tom Hanks where he's stranded on an island? Remember seeing that? He's stuck with survival. And he discovers that the beach is littered with coconuts. But he doesn't know how to open a coconut. So you see him there, he's throwing it against the wall, he's doing everything. We were in the theater watching that, and my daughter just started to howl with laughter at how stupid Tom Hanks was because he didn't know how to open up a coconut. Because of course she's seen coconuts being opened up all of her life, having grown up in the tropics, and couldn't believe the guy could be that naive. But he goes through all these packages. He finally comes across the ice skates, and that gives him a sharp blade now. And so life improves considerably for him. But then he comes across the ball. And what does he do with the ball? He creates a fictitious person, Mr. Wilson, because he's got to have somebody to talk to. We are social creatures. We need somebody to talk to. You go back to the story of creation in Genesis, and there's Adam all by himself. See, and he's God gives him a job. Name the animal. So he's out there, and he's I'm going to call that an elephant. I think I'm going to call that one a monkey, and or whatever, because we don't know what language he was speaking. But anyway, he names off all the animals, and he has a delightful time. He watches the hippopotamus, or the hippopotami. Anyway, he watches the hippopotamus, waddling around. Oh man! And he gives them a cute little name, hippopotamus. Hippopotamus. I love to play with those phrases. And then he sees the dogs chasing the squirrels, and everybody's having fun. And he's had a delightful day naming the animals. And then what happens? He goes to sleep and has a wonderful, restful sleep, right? No. He's all bent out of shape. Why is he bent out of shape? Because he doesn't have anyone like himself. There are male elephants and there are female elephants. There are bulls and there are cows. Everybody's got a mate except him. He felt a horrendous sense of loneliness and isolation. A significant other in your life will change your whole purpose for living. What makes us like this? What makes us such social creatures? Such social creatures that we will change the way we behave, we will change the way we look, we will change the way we dress, we will change everything we can possibly change in order to get along with other people, in order to have other people like us, in order to be a part of the social crowd that is important to us. What makes us like this? We will want to look at this as a research question. And then, sixthly, to what extent are people able to transcend their cultural heritage? To what extent are you capable of becoming somebody other than an American? To what extent are you capable of leaving America and going, let's say, to China and becoming identified with the Chinese, to becoming fully Chinese? Now, this is an interesting question because it is a question that every migrant faces. Some of you here are first-generation Koreans or first-generation Asians or first-generation Hispanics. You are perhaps born in Korea, moved to the United States, and you are now becoming Americanized. To what extent can you be fully Korean and fully American? Can you be bicultural? Can you be fully bicultural? And this is the problem that first and second generation immigrants constantly face. I remember talking with a Korean young woman who said, I am totally Americanized. And she said, I have American values and I think like an American. But she said, I need to be loyal to my parents and I would never think of going against their value system. And because they are traditional Koreans, I will obey them in everything, even if it breaks my heart. Now that's the tension that people find in going between cultures. To what extent are we able to transcend our cultural heritages? To what extent are we able to blend our cultural heritage? To what extent are we able to become, as the Apostle Paul said, all things to all people? Could Paul really become a Spaniard? After all, he wanted to take the gospel to Spain. Paul was a Jewish Roman with strong Greek heritage and Roman heritage, and now he wants to go to Spain. Can he be a good Spaniard? Well, we never found out because he didn't tell us about what happened there. But these are the interesting questions that we raise in anthropology. So those are some of our startup questions. Now, we need to start looking at how each one of these questions and these goals have been applied over the last 100, maybe 150 years. All right? So let's go to the rise of anthropological theory. And we'll talk first about an anthropological theory that was very popular in the 19th century. This theory is called unilineal evolutionary theory. And one of the men most associated with this theory is a fellow by the name of Morgan. His picture's right there on the bottom of the screen. Now, evolutionary theory, social evolutionary theory, is not the same as biological evolutionary theory. Now, Charles Darwin is going around the globe on the Beagle, and he's discovering all kinds of interesting things about biological evolution. He is writing about this in textbooks. He's lecturing on it all over England and the rest of the Western nations. It's a very exciting time. And social scientists are beginning to say, we have a similar problem. And these are not particularly people who are anti-Christian, by the way. These are people who are saying, look, you got Adam and Eve, and they're a pretty simple culture, you know, running around without a lot of sophistication. It's a very simple culture, and then all of a sudden you've got, 2,000 years later, you've got the advanced civilization of the British Empire, and everybody's got, cotton underwear and silk top hats and cutlery and spats and canes and all that sort of stuff, and the women get to walk around with little parasols. This is all wonderful stuff. Where did we get from running around with a loincloth and a bearskin hanging over us to the refinements of England? We've got to explain this evolution from simplicity to complexity, from simplicity to advanced ways of life. So Lewis Henry Morgan comes up with the idea of what he calls unilineal evolutionary theory. And as a hypothesis, he says all cultures start out from the simple and progress through successive stages to the complex. Now that sounds fairly logical. Start simple, become complex. So he says, what we need to do is look for a progression, a unilineal, that's a one-line evolutionary process, which moves us from the state of savagery, see, he puts that on the bottom, savagery, to what he calls barbarism, ultimately to civilization. So this is how human societies have evolved. Savagery, barbarism, civilization. So, so far that logically sounds quite acceptable. So then he decides that we've got to test this out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look for evidences that cultures move from savages to barbarism to civilization. Let's look first of all at the tools that they used. So we go back to the early days of savagery. What kind of tools did they have? Well, they had stones. They used stones to pound things. They sometimes sharpened stones and made them into stone axes. They started making stone spear tips to put on the end of their throwing sticks. Everything was fairly simple and relied on stones and fairly raw materials, and this is how they got through life. Then these same savage people would have a very simple form of social organization, according to this idea. If you've got a social organization at the savage level, then basically it's kind of like a mob. all this mob is out there, and the might is right, and there's going to be a well, it's sort of like the rule of some dogs. You get dogs together, and what begins to emerge? You have an alpha dog. And the alpha dog, he drives off all of the male competitors. See? All of the young juvenile dogs get driven off. And as long as he remains strong, he controls the pack. And Lewis Stanley Morgan says, oh, that must be how early civilizations started up. You started up with a family. There's a dad. Dad tells his sons, look, you guys beat it out of here. I'm in charge of this mob, and you can stay only as long as you're willing to obey me, but I get first choice of all the good-looking girls, kind of thing. And so this was his hypotheses. Now, of course, he's beginning to develop his hypotheses. If this is going to be what life is like at the savage level, what's it like at the barbarism level? Well, in barbarism, your tools are going to become much more sophisticated. Your tools are going to become Bronze Age. We're going to start making bronze knives, bronze shields. We're going to start making more sophisticated tools. As a matter of fact, as we begin to move up, not only do we develop bronze tools, and by the way, you start seeing the entrance of bronze tools into the Bible around about the time of Gideon in the book of Judges. We're not told it, but from looking at archaeological evidence and knowing what we know about the time of Gideon and Judges, the Philistines and the Israelites would all have used bronze tools. So they're beginning to develop more sophistication. They're beginning to come up with helmets to cover their heads. They're beginning to come up with war vests. They're beginning to come up with a whole lot more advanced technology. And voila, they're going to invent the plow. Now, under savages, you only plant by taking a digging stick and drilling a hole and sticking some seeds in. But with savagery, or with the middle level there, we now have a single plow that can allow us to have the ability to harness horses or mules or donkeys or whatever that can pull our plows. So we're getting much more sophisticated. Ultimately, we're going to move up to civilization, and in the barbaric stage, we've got bows and arrows for weapons. And then we're going to have catapults for throwing huge boulders over the walls. But under civilization, see, we're really going to advance now. Under civilization, we're going to have a plow that will actually be shaped with steel that will turn the soil over, not just create a furrow, but will actually turn the soil over, and we can have a gang plow with multiple blades on it, and we can get up to the steam engine, and we can start using coal power, and is life going to become wonderful as we develop more sophisticated tools. Same thing with social organization. We have the alpha dog cultures. Then you get, we're going to start having big men, We're going to have, leadership by elders, and we're going to start getting along with one another, and we're going to start having social systems where you've got higher class and lower classes. You've got the thinking class, and you've got the working class, and everybody's going to be able to develop much more specific job performances, and then ultimately we're going to get into modern English organization, where we have nobles and barons and squires and knights, and then there's the rest of us who are peasants. But then there are those who are the merchants, and you've got sailors and you've got soldiers, et cetera, and life begins to organize itself. Then they talked about language. Well, we would expect that early savages had a very simple language, and it would consist of a lot of ugs, ugh, and then they get a little bit more sophisticated. Me, yeah, you, yeah. Me, like you, this begin to develop, a bit of a vocabulary, and I don't know. It's an old movie. Did it? But have any of you ever seen that film, Quest for Fire, Search for Fire, something like that? Any of you seen that? Where a couple of these bonehead cavemen are supposed to be watching the fire, and it goes out, and all of the people in his clan, they're all mad at them. You let the fire go. Now we don't have fire. You got to go out and find fire. And so they drive them out to go find fire and bring it back. And so they go out and they find all these other tribes of people, and they have to run up the tree to get away from dinosaur animals or wild animals or big saber-toothed cats, and they run into all these other hostile tribes, and they rescue some pretty maidens, and ultimately they find fire that's been started by lightning, and they come back and they're now heroes. But the interesting thing about the whole film is it's supposed to represent the early stages of savagery. Since none of you seem to have seen the movie, you don't probably know about the most outstanding feature of it. There's no dialogue, because all they do is grunt. They are sophisticated chimpanzees, is what they are. They don't have any language. It took a while for us to develop language skills. And as we developed language skills, we moved away from grunting and groaning to actually beginning to say coherent sentences. And then ultimately, when we get up to civilization, we actually have poems, songs, where we can play with language. We can make it rhyme. It becomes a beautiful expression, and language becomes very complex. So this was what they were looking for. Well, same thing with religion. Religion for the early savages must have been just simply fear. Oh, lightning comes. What are we going to do about the lightning? Maybe we can make the lightning go away by doing magic. And so they do a little bit of magic, and the lightning stops. That worked. So we'll keep that little practice. Next time it has lightning, we'll do it again. And so fear becomes the motivation for religion, actually fear and ignorance. But then we begin to develop a belief in spirits, and then we develop a concept of multiple gods, and ultimately we end up with monotheism at the very apex. Do you begin to see a pattern emerging here? civilization is always molded after the lifestyle of the British. You see, because it's the British who are making this system. So England is the apex of civilization, everything that's good in society, and we've developed all of these things. Well, let's go back. We're not quite ready for that yet. How did all of this work out as we looked at these tools, social organization, language, and religion? What we discover is that under closer examination, we discovered that the so-called primitive people, the so-called savages, were not as simple as we had imagined. For instance, when it came to tools, they're supposed to be pounding things with rocks. They're supposed to have simple tools. But then they went down to Australia and discovered the Australian Aborigines. Now, the Australian Aborigines were considered to be some of the most simplistic of the cultures of the world, the closest to human origins of any known people group. And here are these Aborigines, and they've got a hunting tool. And that hunting tool is called a boomerang. And the boomerang is an aeronautical piece of high achievement. It is shaped properly to be able to carry out wind flow, and it is shaped so that it will come back to you when you throw it. Now, a good Aborigine did not throw his boomerang at an animal, and in case he missed it, hope it would come back to him. Because if it missed it, you were a bad shot. There was a reason why you wanted that thing to come around in a circle, and it was not to come back to you. You'd be out there hunting, and you'd see a eucalyptus tree. And up in that eucalyptus tree is well, let's make it a koala bear. You all love those little koala bears, don't you? Yeah, well, they're good to eat too. And so there'd be a koala bear up there, and the koala bear would see the Aborigine. So the koala bear says, "Ha, you're not getting me, dude." So they'd go around behind the tree, see, where the hunter couldn't get him. And if he'd go around, then the koala bear would go around the other side. So they invented the boomerang, where they could go up there and they could throw the boomerang this way. The koala bear's over here. And the boomerang would go around, come around behind the tree, and bonk, zap the koala bear, knock him to the ground. Voila, we now have supper. I know. Not supposed to eat koala bears because they're so cute. Don't try handling one of them. They will tear you to shreds. I could have made it a tree kangaroo, but none of you would know what a tree kangaroo was. But we used to have tree kangaroos and we tried to make a pet out of one of them. Oh, they can be vicious. Teeth and claws that will just tear your hands to shreds. But anyway, they found a way to hunt with an aerodynamically precise tool. And then you take the Eskimo or the Inuit, and they have developed hunting techniques for trying to find out when a seal is coming up to a breathing hole and whether it's time to be able to thrust down a spear to catch it. If they make the wrong move, the seal will dive again. And so they would make a little feather holder over the breathing hole, and then they would position their spear, and then they would wait. And when they saw the feather begin to blow or move, they would know that a seal was down there. And by knowing a little bit about how it blew, they would know whether the seal was over there or over here, because here's the hole, and they could move their spear, thrust it down in, and impale the seal, and voila, they've got supper. They had very sophisticated tools, even in the simplicity that was supposed to be characteristic of them. Same thing with social organization. When it came to social organization, the early anthropologists said, oh, primitive societies must be very simple. So then they went down to Australia and started to look at the Australian kinship system. And to their surprise, discovered they had a very complex kinship system. Very complex kinship system. And the first anthropologists who started studying them wrote back to their professors in England and said, it's a very complex system. And the professor wrote back and said, can't be. They're savages. You got it all wrong. And in order to graduate, the poor old anthropologist in the field had to fudge his data. They were very complex. And when it comes to language, well, I went to West Papua, and I was assigned to work with a Highlands tribal group, and their language was what we call Proto-Austronesian. That means it was one of the very earliest of the languages to come into the South Pacific. The language that I had to learn, supposed to be a very simple language, has 2,000 ways of conjugating a verb. Every time you use a verb, you have to pick 1 to 10 ways to conjugate it in order to tell who's doing the action, when they're doing the action, where they're doing the action, how the action is taking place, and what is the intention behind the action. There were very, very few fluent speakers of Dani among our missionary community. It was a complex language. And north of us was a tonal language, once again, very, very ancient. It was so complex that it's called the Iao language. The Iao language, you could say every vowel 1 of 5 different ways. When we put that into writing, we had to put the letter I or E, and then we had to put a little number above it, E1, E2, E3, E4, E5, and then same thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when we wrote Iao, we would have to put the number up there to tell you what tone to pick. Now, it was possible to reduce a tonal language to writing, but it took the very best linguist in the world to analyze that language and to come up with a writing system for them. The so-called primitive peoples were not that primitive. They were very complex.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.